Okay, everyone, thank you for joining. Again, we're going to get started because we have quite a bit of content to cover. Welcome. My name is Dr. Marta Shliva. I am the Assistant Director of Doctoral Life Design with the Doctoral Life Design Studio, and I work with the School of Medicine population, and I'm also the Program Director for Options, and I'm joined here with my colleague, Dr. Andrea Pereira. Andrea?
Thanks, Marta. So I am Andrea Pereira, and I am the Assistant Director of Postdoctoral Life Design. That means that I work with all the postdocs across all campuses and colleges here at Hopkins, helping them with their professional development and career advancement. And I'm happy to be here and sharing this with Marta and with all of you.
Yes, we are very excited to host this hybrid virtual two facilitator workshop. It's the first one we've done. Please bear with us as we work out any tech kinks. But today, Andrea and I are going to explore with you all how to design impactful slides that enhance rather than detract from your presentations, whether they're for conferences, thesis meetings, professional business pitches, and other types of presentations, or even leading a workshop. It's very important to keep in mind that the way that your slides look can make a huge difference in how you're relaying information to your audiences. And we'll also be following up. I know this is always a frequently asked question with the session recording, as well as a copy of the slides that you can view and revert back to whenever you'd like, as well as some additional resources that we'll touch on throughout the workshop. So we'll share all of that via email over the next few days after the workshop concludes. So we're just going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to cover, as I mentioned, and we want to make sure we get through it all. I want you all to think back to the last talk that you were an audience member for. Let's say it was a research or technical talk. I want you to think, what did you think about the talk? Was it engaging and interesting, maybe boring and overwhelming? Perhaps it was a topic that was important to you, maybe part of a seminar within your department, but it was presented in a way that made it a little bit difficult to engage with the content that was covered. So one common pitfall that I see a lot is a significant disconnect between the way a speaker crafts a presentation and the needs of that specific audience. So to bridge this gap in audience understanding, it's important to consider a few ideas that are core to effective presentations. And we'll talk a little bit more about them and how they inform presentation and even more granularly, slide design principles. So to begin, we'll start by talking about very broadly the elements of an effective presentation, which include centering your audience, highlighting the relevance of the topic that's being presented, as well as making sure that it's engaging and understandable to those that are viewing and listening. So we'll start with focusing a little bit more on this first concept of centering your audience. And first, I wanted to go over why, that question of why it's important to consider your audience and who you're speaking to. Your audience informs how you convey your message, how you structure your presentation, as well as what information you include within it. Your talk or presentation can cater to a variety of audiences, again, that will inform how you want to structure that message. And you should consider them when planning your presentation as well as when practicing and designing your slides and your overall goal as a whole. And your talk should be informed by intentional decisions that you make to form a mutual exchange. So not only are you presenting information, but you're wanting your audience to exchange in return an understanding, right? You want to make sure that message lands. So there are some strategies that you can use to make sure that you're considering your audience. And there's 3 steps. You can assess, set goals, and prepare. So using these sort of 3 major steps while you're creating your presentation and crafting your slides. So when you assess your audience, there's no way to truly know who might be showing up to a seminar talk. However, it's possible to reflect on how you can tailor your talk to consider them. You can check assumptions and reframe them, for example, as considerations when planning your speaking points and what you want to include. How might your assumptions manifest in your talk? Consider that as well. What questions are your assumptions getting at? For example, you might assume that your audience consists of only clinicians, so all of my examples should be clinician focused. Instead, try reframing as, I recognize that my audience may consist of clinicians, but that does not mean that it is the only discipline in my audience. How can I use examples that capture that variety? Some other questions you might ask yourself: Who is your audience? What is it made of? What do they know? Maybe what do they not know? Why are they here and why are they attending? And what biases might they have against the topic or the information that you're sharing? So that's a little bit more detail as to how to assess your audience. Setting goals, so that's second step. So when you're preparing for your talk, set goals that center your audience. Centering your audience can help you prioritize being understood rather than just rambling on with a bunch of information on a slide. So rather than simply sharing as much information as you can into a talk, focus again on that mutual exchange. You're sharing information and hoping that there is understanding being given in return. So what does that look like in practice? An information-centered goal might sound like, I want to get as much information into this talk within my given time frame. And you may have reached your goal of sharing a load of information, but at what cost? You might lose your audience. You might not be focusing in on relevant or key takeaways. If you reframe that goal to be audience-centered, you might say, I want to have a conversation with my audience and have them stay attuned to cues and questions that arise. So now you're recognizing that giving your talk is an exchange, and you begin to consider how to put that realization and assessment and goal of centering the audience into practice. And then that last step is preparing. So considering your audience promotes intentionality and also requires a lot of intentionality. So there should be a why behind the decisions that you make when preparing your talk. Remember your goals. What are they? Are they audience-centered? Are they very information-heavy and information-centered? Some other sub-strategies here. Filter and focus rather. Strategize your talk with an end goal in mind and think about what you want your audience to walk away knowing. Limit any unnecessary details. You might have spent 4 months on developing a method, but your audience doesn't have to know that. Your research is going to have many important aspects that you want to share, but think about, again, your particular audience and what's most important for them to know. Also, recenter the so what often throughout your presentation. So build that in when planning. Think about how to bookmark where you are in the presentation or the topic that you're discussing and reframing that general question or problem statement that you're presenting at the beginning. And there's another little phrase I like to use, snorkel, don't scuba dive, right? So if it's useful to associate this with an image, find a balance between incorporating a good amount of detail versus diving too deep into something that's going to lose your audience entirely. So again, remember to always consider your audience, and this will naturally lead to a presentation that effectively highlights the relevance of your topic and is also engaging and understandable. And what now the question is, can we use to visualize these elements, right? Slides. So slides are a tool that allow you to do. So just starting with a little bit of a fundamental principle here, slides, remember this always, are your visual aid. They're meant to enhance your spoken words and not replace them entirely. So the best slides will support your storytelling and engagement while remaining clear and simple, right? You're not meant to be reading off of your slides or turning your back to the audience in the case of an in-person presentation. So your goal should be to design slides that effectively reinforce your message without overwhelming your audience or making it so that you're reading content directly off of them. Again, they are visual aids, not substitutes for your verbal speech or spoken word. They should support your storytelling and enhance with clarity and also increase engagement with the audience. And you should always keep content on a slide simple, clean, and focused, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. So one key thing to remember, each slide should also try to incorporate a takeaway message, not just another topic that you're adding to the plates of the audience. So we've talked about the importance of centering your audience, some strategies for how to do, and now we'll get into those tangents that support the message of any presentation or purpose that you're trying to get across and keep your audience engaged throughout. And now Andrea will take you through this next section here.
Thank you, Marta. I feel like we spend a lot of time and effort into thinking about the audience, the message we want to give, running all the experiments or scholarly work. And then when we go get the slides ready, sometimes we do ourselves a disservice because we have great ideas, great research, but we just don't convey them clearly. So the next part of the conversation is going to be about some tips and strategies for designing those slides. And it's not one fit all. And you might have your own preferences, and maybe your field has a specific rules of engagement that you want to consider. These are overall criteria that might help. Most people will agree that these strategies will end up in a good product after you go through them. So most people think, okay, I have a presentation to give. I'm going to open my PowerPoint or my Canva or whatever platform you use, and I'm just going to start putting things there, just dumping graphs and text, and then I'll arrange them and play with the software. I would highly encourage you not to do that. And maybe this is one of the things you try if you feel you're struggling with putting your slides together and your presentations feel clunky or you don't get good feedback. Maybe take a step back. Don't do that yet. Don't open PowerPoint yet. Think about the who, which Marta already covered. Think about where are you presenting. Maybe you're going to a conference that has a guideline. So ask for rules, right? Are there any rules or regulations that I need to consider when I put my PowerPoint together? If it's not clear, that's a valid question to ask to anybody that invites you to give a talk. And then also consider how long are you going to present? Well, all the things that we're going to mention, they can be applied for shorter or longer presentations. It's not the same to put a 15-minute talk than to put a 60-minute talk together. So get all that information well in advance, and then have a story in mind. Again, before dumping things in the PowerPoint, think, what is that I want to tell them? What is a little tiny story about my research that matches my audience, that matches this context, and then I know I can deliver in 10, 15, or 60 minutes. And once you have that, I encourage you to outline the same way you would do for a paper or your thesis or a grant. Just open a PowerPoint, maybe grab 10 empty slides and jot some thoughts on each slide before you get lost in the animations and colors and fun special effects. So we're all different, but I would say most of us get distracted by that, or we search for images on the web. So before you do all that, outline. You will notice a difference when you go back to a PowerPoint and work on it. And it also lowers the anxiety that it generates, maybe the idea of putting a talk together if this is your first time. If you're a seasoned presenter, then that's not a problem. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of a slide, like different parts and components and the do's and don'ts for each of them. So usually all the slides will have a title. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes you have a big image on the screen. That's perfectly fine. But it's good practice to get a slide title because it conveys the main idea of what we are saying at that particular time. Keep it short and informative. And if possible, use a statement and not just a label. And we'll talk about that in a second. And also make it visible. These points or sizes that we propose here are not mandatory. They're just an idea for you to have. The bigger the title, the more focused people are going to be on those letters and words. The smaller the title, the more is going to blend. So think about the intention you have with your slides. So this is an example of what we are talking about. Don't use a label, use a message. So let's pretend that you are presenting this and you want to talk about scaffolds that enhance wound healing. And the bottom part is the message you want to give. You want people to walk away from your talk knowing that these scaffolds enhance wound healing by promoting tissue regeneration. So instead of just writing results and going into your results, which says nothing, maybe you want to take it a step further. And maybe you want to put something like this in the title, which is a statement, right? Relationship between X and Y. So now, even if I'm distracted, checking my phone, replying to emails, and I'm glancing through your presentation, I have an idea of what you're talking about versus just results. But you can also take it a step further and actually tell me what your results are through your title. So again, if I'm lost and confused and I wasn't following properly, if I take a look at your title, I know exactly what you're talking about. You have given me a takeaway message with the title. And these are other examples from other fields. They don't have to be so lengthy. They don't have to be so wordy. Maybe you don't want to give away your message just yet, but make sure that at some point during the explanation of your slide, something like this shows up because that will be your takeaway message. And remember, one message per slide would be the sweet spot. Then you're going to fill your main content area, right? You're going to think about what to put in here. And it's going to be probably a combination of text, visuals. Ideally, keep it minimal. I know that probably ourselves here in this presentation, we are violating the code that we just created for ourselves. This was because time is of the essence and we wanted to crunch as much information as possible. So do as we say, not as we do, basically. So you would animate this and you wouldn't have so many words, but keep it to a minimal. Rely on your visuals. Every discipline can be summarized sometimes in an illustration or a graph. So pivot to those if you have some. And just this idea of try to put only one message or key idea per slide. Don't talk to me about the causes, consequences, and possible solutions of something all at once, unless it's an intro slide and you're really timing it properly and you have very few pieces of information that people want to know. If not, just keep it to one message per slide. And then if you are going to use text in your slides, because at some point you will have to, just think about keeping to a minimum. You don't have to write long paragraphs. That's not necessary. Nobody will read them. They will be listening to you, and maybe you are going to reflect the highlights of what you're saying with 3 to 7 words, and that's it. If you're going to provide a list, there is a magic number 3. For some reason, people tend to remember lists of 3 or groups of 3 more than 5, 6, or 2. So don't put a lot of things in your slide either, and make it visible, right? You don't want people to be squinting and not being able to read what you're saying. And you have to make sure that the person sitting in the back of the room is also able to see your slides. Then don't overdo it for emphasis. We all have the tendency to use capital letters and italics or underline or bold because we just want to make a point and we end up with too much on the slide and I don't know where to pay attention. So if you're going to choose a way of highlighting something, keep it consistent, keep it to that. And remember that the slides are not the presenter's note. And this is something probably easier said than done. We all get anxiety sometimes when we present. We try to put a lot on the slides because it's helping us, but it's really not helping the audience. So practice will come later, and then that's how you can master this without relying on a lot of text. And always think, stop and think. I put a lot of things here, a lot of text here. Could this be replaced by a figure, an illustration, a picture, a little video or audio? Can I use something else than written words on my screen? And here we have an example from the web that Marta found, and I don't think we need to spend a lot of time here to say if this is an effective or an ineffective slide. And you can read it just for fun after we share it with you because it has a lot of nice hidden messages there. So what would you say is wrong with this slide if we have to apply the principles that we just discussed? It's too wordy, definitely too much text. It's too small, very small letters. So if I put this here and I talk on top of this and I try to explain and synthesize, and then I move to the next slide in 5 seconds, would you say that's an effective way of conveying anything? Can you grab anything from it? Will you remember anything from it? Full sentences. Yes, you are all correct. So we took a stab at how we could change this. If you have slides like this, and I've seen a lot of people doing this, maybe you want to consider this, right? Why do you think this would be less or more effective? Or actually, let me rephrase it. What did you feel when the slide changed from the previous one to this one in terms of how quickly can you grab information? Relief. I love it. Thank you so much. You feel relieved that you didn't have to read through all of it. So it's better. Definitely good. Definitely less text. Colorful. It's information is here. But still, I think it can be improved because we don't need everything that is in the left. We could just focus on the figure and talk about how the US is the principal export location for fruits from Chile. And that's all you needed to know. And it was the same 3 slides ago, but now you can actually focus on it. And here we have another example of a lot of information, a lot of different formatting, too much for one slide that can definitely be condensed and streamline if you have something like this. Maybe it could even be better, but definitely it's a relief compared to the previous one. And now we're back to Marta.
Andrea took us through some general concepts and tips for the title section of your slide, your main content and text. And Andrea alluded to the use of visuals as well. So I'll go into some techniques and strategies there. Choosing the right type of visualization, whether that's a chart, a graph, an image, or icon, is very important. For those who have data-heavy research, we could do an entirely different presentation on how to choose the right graph. But for the sake of this workshop, we're going to keep those insights very brief and focus on just more general strategies and tips. You always want to remember, no matter what you choose, that your visuals are high quality and high resolution. Make sure when you're pasting something in, or be careful of screen grabs and screenshots. You don't want something to be super grainy as soon as it's blown up on a projector screen. It'll detract from the efficacy and effectiveness of your presentation very heavily. So you might want to consider some moving objects, maybe contrast-rich objects, as well as big objects within your graphs and visuals or your data sets and how they're represented. Be careful, though, of overusing animations and transitions. I know we were all taught that in our middle school, maybe elementary school, sometimes high school days, but they do detract from the attention of the audience to the content that you're trying to relay to those that are listening. Example of a simple slide that uses visuals. This is actually from my PhD thesis presentation. So this includes the magic number of 3 bullet points. Again, one thing I want to highlight, you want to keep them to one line as well. You don't want bullet points with multiple lines. There's a simple title, some takeaway points that are used that I mentioned during my verbal talk during my PhD thesis defense, as well as a big visual from the supporting paper that supports the context of those bullets. So here's just one way to structure. Again, we'll go a lot more into the layout and use of white space later in the workshop, but just an example of how you can effectively use a visual to support your content. So now, as this slide shows, very commonly an approach to slides is that left to right reading technique. So you start on the top left with a bullet point, you move your eyes over to the visual on the right. Another way to use visuals is that you can blow up an image, have it take up most of the slide, maybe desaturate a little bit so it's not too highly contrasting with the bullet or information that you're trying to relay. And then you can include that bullet or a data point that really pops. It's a nice and effective aesthetic. Andy, in the chat, I saw you mentioned that organizational culture matters. Obviously, you probably wouldn't make a slide like this for a thesis presentation, but it is a nice approach for something like a business pitch, or if you're looking to do some sort of other presentations or pitches beyond your thesis research. Again, general advice structured for this workshop in terms of how you can play with and use visuals to enhance and all the components of a workshop slide. What not to do when blowing up an example is blowing up a photo, rather, an image, and having it take up most of the slide, is having text that overlays that's really difficult to read here, right? So this image is very busy. The text is hard to read. You have these elements coming up from the back. The big takeaway lesson here is that visuals and visual creativity are great, but make sure you're, one, using them appropriately and also using them in a way that's considering the accessibility of your audience and what they can actually see and take away from the slide. This personally gives me a headache, so don't do this. Don't use super complicated and layered components that are clashing with each other. So when visuals are used correctly, they're actually a great tool. There's a concept out there known as the picture superiority effect, and that actually indicates that when an audience hears a piece of information, 3 days later, you'll remember about 10% of it. But if you add a picture to accompany that information, whether it's text or also verbally shared, you'll remember 65% of that information 3 days later. And this is a concept that's heavily used actually in advertising, billboards, marketing, as well as education, where you see diagrams and images in textbooks. So it's something to keep in the back of your mind. And Andrea posed this question: can I represent something in a visual or a picture over just words? Makes that takeaway message a lot more effective if you're able to incorporate it. The strength or effectiveness of that picture superiority effect will depend on several factors, including discoverability. So people must be able to quickly and easily discover the visual and see it for it to be memorable. It has to be clear. So the more concrete and literal the visual is, the more memorable it will be. It has to be familiar. Obviously, that's difficult in a research context when you're providing new data, but we'll talk a little bit more about how to use some advanced techniques for focusing in on specific data aspects and making sure that you're clear and effective and takeaway points when you do have data heavy slides, as well as uniqueness. So the more unique a visual is, maybe compared to something else that was on a slide before it, not necessarily unique in and of itself, the more memorable it will be. Okay, so now Andrea will take us through another aspect of considering visuals here.
We discussed how we can leverage both text and visuals and how those are essential components of the slides. But I would like to throw a word of caution here, because if you use too many design elements on a given slide, that's going to compete for attention. And I'm sure you all had this issue, and you can all maybe remember a presentation where you were listening to the person, you remember what that person was wearing, or if they had an accent, how did it sound, or if they made a joke, or if they told a story. If I ask, do you actually remember the slides per se? You might say, not so much. I was focusing on the person. And I'm sure we can find examples, plenty of examples on the opposite. You were just focusing on the screen because you had no time to pay attention to anything else. And the person was speaking, but you don't really remember what they were saying. So when you put something on the screen, that's where people are going to gravitate towards. That's going to be the thing that grabs their attention, and you don't want that. Going back to the beginning of the presentation, you want to be the star. Actually, you want your message to be the star, and you are out there giving a talk, an oral presentation for a reason. So make that, always go back to thinking that should be the main point, and the rest is just a support. So when we listen and when we see things, that messes up with our brain and the way we compute information. So for example, let me show you what I mean. If I put this here and I start walking you through this, what do you think is going to happen? Are you really paying attention to what I'm saying at the moment? Maybe you are because you're at a workshop. But if we were in a presentation, in a real talk, you're going to be looking at things like, should I look from left to top to bottom? Oh, there's an illustration. Great. There's a great use of white space. It's not very cluttered. It's not like clutter like the one from the Chilean exports, but still, this is not effective. Why? Because either you read it or you listen to me. So we can do things, if you have slides like this in your presentation that might be somehow effective, you can even improve them further. So maybe you just want to have an illustration, just the illustration, and set the tone. We're going to talk about X, Y, and Z. And you're going to start throwing facts at them, right? That's usually the case. Either it's an intro or it's your results. So when you say something, pick a word or two or three that really represent that, and then throw it in there. So if I'm listening to you, the visual cue that I get is a reinforcement of what I just listened. Then make a pause and go to fact number 2. Pick a word or two that represents them, putting there. And then so on and so forth. And remember, group of 3 better than group of 8. However, what we tend to do is we tend to take this to the maximum, and we tend to do this. We tend to use a very paced way of speaking. We have only a few words, but now we have a list of 8 things. Will I remember a list of 8 things after 30 seconds? Probably not. And then we take it another notch, and then we start adding things to this, right? We are animating our very complex slide. We took it from very simple to very complex, and now we're adding more information, and more information. Because instead of having 3 slides, we just wanted to have 1 with all the messages. Although this seems like a good thing to do, and we see this over and over in other presentations from colleagues and professors and other speakers in our field, at the end of the day, when I stop talking and you have this in front of you, it was hard to follow. And now Marta will talk to you about color and contrast.
So another important component of slide design is the correct use of color and contrast. So again, getting into more of these techniques now here. You want to use color meaningfully, and I'll give some examples of what that doesn't look like. Don't overdo it, not highlighting in a ton of different colors on a slide and distracting and detracting from what you're trying to share with your audience, especially if you're complementing a visual with additional text. You should use complementary colors only if it's absolutely necessary, and also just tying in again that consideration for accessibility. There are softwares and websites like Venngage and Coolers that you can use to look, for example, colorblind palettes or find palettes that are complementary to each other and are easy on the eye. They'll give you hex codes for those colors and similar that you can combine safely for people who are colorblind, also to just increase the accessibility and general visibility of your colors that you're using overall as well. In addition to color, it's also important to consider contrast. So high contrast is always very effective, but dark text on a light background is best for large rooms. So when you're projecting something during your thesis defense presentation or during a group meeting or during a conference, considering that light background dark text to be a little bit more accessible and effective for those large spaces is something to keep in mind. So here are some examples of what not to do. Again, you don't want to use a font color that does not contrast with the background. It's hard for me to even read this yellow text, even though I know what's on this slide. Using color for emphasis is okay sometimes, but if it's overused, it's distracting, right? You're trying to find which color your eye should be focusing on. There's no distinct delineation between what's being emphasized and what's the core message. And then using a different color for each line is unnecessary. And also, if you're going to use bullet points, just flip-flopping between colors can also be a little bit too distracting for the point of a presentation, especially if you're trying to present important and crucial data. Here's another example of a pretty horrendous slide. So I don't think I have to go into the details of why this is just ineffective. The photo's blurry. There's this bright green on or yellow on green. It's giving me a headache. It will definitely give your viewers a headache, and you'll probably end up stumbling over potentially the words that you're trying to share or the message that you're trying to bring across. So these are things not to do. Color and contrast. We'll get to this a little bit later, but when you review your presentation after you've created it, it's always good to take a step back and think, is this the clearest way that I could be presenting this? Is there any sort of detail or frill that I can cut out in terms of color use and design before your final product is put together? Until now, we've talked about the anatomy of a slide, we've broken down those building blocks, and now we'll talk a little bit about layout. So the layout of your slide, or how you should be structuring and placing things on the actual PowerPoint or Canva or whatever software you'd like to use, should be consistent and also adhere to a few guidelines. So if you're going to include text, left-aligned text is the easiest to read. Make sure you're not using bullet points that are centered with a bullet point all the way to the left. It just becomes distracting. Whatever you choose to do, whether you're incorporating text and an image or blowing up the image as the whole slide with some bullet points on top, just make sure you have a very logical flow for how the audience's eye should move. It doesn't always have to be left to right, but as long as it's logical and it's following some sort of structure, that will make sure that your message that you're saying or speaking is not distracting from the audience trying to follow what's going on the slide. How you structure your layout should also be consistent across the entire presentation, right? So you don't want to be changing the way that you format your slides drastically throughout the middle of a presentation. There was also a question in the chat on how to make sure that co-collaboration on presentations is seamless. That's probably the biggest thing, one of the biggest things that you want to focus on as well, right? People can contribute their content, but then one person should own or take ownership over making sure that the design is cohesive across so that it doesn't seem like you're giving two separate presentations stitched together. Andrea and I had to put this in practice while preparing for this talk as well. Again, try to avoid cramming in too much content and embrace white space. It is very clean. It can make your slides look very simple. There's a lot of power in knowing how to use your white space effectively and not being afraid to have some white corners or blank corners of your slide showing. It's just a lot easier on the eye and how your audience is receiving the information that you're sharing. So this is an example of a little bit of an overwhelming layout, right? The slide is a little bit too crowded. There's more than one message, so that goes against that key tip of incorporating one message or takeaway per slide. There's also no logical flow, right? I'm looking at the title, then I'm looking at the left, the image is in the middle, the right, there's another block of text, and then these solutions are at the bottom. There's also an overuse of bullet points and lists. All of this makes it a little bit confusing. So this is a type of layout that you'd like to avoid. Again, it's just overload, and people will read different things depending on how they absorb information effectively. This is another example of a bad layout. So the previous slide was structured on Impressionism a little bit differently, but it's been slightly modified to have center aligned text here. It's a little bit harder to read this title, especially with these graphics bumping up against it. It's got these 4 quadrants that are not really organized in any sort of logic. So unless the speaker is clearly stating what particular point of the slide they are speaking about, and the audience is able to look as well as listen effectively, which is, again, very hard for audience members to do typically, you'll lose your audience in not being able to find a logical flow to what's happening. And I really love art, so I'd probably stare at this Claude Monet in the bottom left corner for the entire time and then just totally blank out anything that's being shared with me by the presenter. So that's, again, in stark contrast to the more streamlined, organized, and easily readable version of this slide that we also saw before. And now Andrea will go into some other concepts and general tips for overall design.
So we talked about a lot of the different parts of the slide itself, right? The title, the text, the visuals, the layout. But now you have to put the slide deck together. And sometimes we're very good at creating the slides individually, but we really don't know what would work better. Should I have this one first or this one second? Maybe I need a transition, and that's a hard part for me. I don't really know how to get there. So we're gonna talk a little bit about order and length of your presentation. And again, generic rules, use your judgment, but here are some tips for you to brainstorm. So I have this quote that I came across not so long ago, and I like it, and I'll tell you why I like it. So it says, tell them what you're going to tell them. Now tell them. Then tell them you told them. It's like a tongue twister or a trabalengua if we have any Spanish speakers in the room. The idea is that this is a principle for any sort of communication, even if it's a 10-minute talk or a 60-minute talk. You want to lay the grounds, then you want to actually tell them about your results or findings or work, and then you want to reinforce what you just told them through your conclusions. So you can use this principle when you're designing your slides if you are not sure of how to organize them. So tell them what you're going to tell them, that should be your intro. If it's a 60-minute talk, you might want to have an agenda. It reduces the anxiety in the room to be able to know how many things are you going to cover, what are you going to cover, and how many sections have you split this into. It always eases the audience knowing that. Then you're going to tell them, you're going to present your findings or results or whatever scholarly work you're doing. And then you're going to go back to your conclusions to actually reinforce all those messages. So if you follow that logic flow on your presentation when you're organizing it, then you might have everything covered. Now, you'll see probably lists like this in some of the slide design presentations or articles or books or resources, but there's no rule, actually. You have to see what works for you based on where you're presenting, to whom, and how long. So if you don't want to use each of these sections, at least make sure that you're covering, you have a title slide with your name, your affiliation, the place and the date of what you're going to present. If you have a very long talk, consider putting an agenda. And even if you have a 15-minute talk, maybe an agenda is also good. If you feel you're going to be changing gears a lot, that might help. Usually you're going to have some sort of intro or background, and you don't have to label it like that, but you have to set the stage of what you're going to talk. As biomedical scientists, we tend a lot to talk about our methods and approach. But as Marta mentioned, even if you spend 6 months troubleshooting an experiment that was not working, maybe your audience does not need to know. So this feels more like a manuscript than a talk if you really cover everything. But maybe your presentation is absolutely about a method that you developed, then you want to provide technical details as well. Your findings or your results should be actually the star of the presentation and should consume the most of your time and slides. And then it's always a good idea to put a conclusion takeaway slide at the very end. And I have that little question mark at the acknowledgement slide, because how many, raise your hand or put in the chat, what is the percentage of talks that you've seen that end with an acknowledgement slide, right? The person finishes their talk with either that or something that prompts for questions. And then they spend another 10 minutes discussing questions and concepts with something in the background that is either acknowledgements or questions. So I would encourage you to actually try to put a summary slide again after the acknowledgements. So when you're done talking, your last slide, the one that remains on the screen, is actually your summary or conclusion slide. It really prompts questions. It helps people actually asking those questions and be more curious about your work. Now, this is a good tip that Marta was telling me yesterday. If you have a long presentation, or maybe not so long, but if you change gears a lot, that agenda slide that you created at the very beginning, try to place it throughout your presentation, just to remind people, we've already covered this, now this is coming. And usually it also triggers some smiles because, oh, we're close to the end. Okay, we're almost there, last stretch. So that also helps your audience. Now, regarding the length, it's going to be dictated by how much time do you have to present. And again, there's no rule, but definitely you don't want to be rushing. I think we've all made that mistake, rookie mistake of cramming a lot of information. We want to tell the world everything that we're doing, and we put a lot of information on our slides. Probably we have done today, but for a different reason. So there's this rule of thumb that you should cover one slide per 1 to 3 minutes for most presentations. I just think that's very arbitrary. It's a good measurement, but you need to see it for yourself. You need to put your presentation together, and you need to practice, and you need to time it, and you need to see how long are you spending on the slides. But you have some sort of estimates there. Maybe you have a transition slide that takes no more than 10 seconds, and you can have 20 of those that will not impact the final count. And now I'll pass it back to Marta, because she's going to tell you about some very cool advanced techniques.
Thank you, Andrea. And to be the verbal agenda, this is the last section of our presentation before we go into some Q&A and FAQs that we have also compiled. We've covered some general guidelines for how to effectively design your slides. Now, as Andrea mentioned, we'll go into some more detailed advanced techniques that are a little bit more specifically applicable to research or data-heavy presentations that you might be giving. For research-based presentations, there is a model called the assertion evidence model, which is highly effective, that you might consider adopting. Again, it's not the right, or there's no right or wrong way to do this, as long as it's consistent internally and gets your message across. In the assertion evidence model, a slide will include a clear takeaway message at the top, followed by supporting visuals. So this method keeps slides concise while ensuring that your key message is communicated effectively. So here's an example of a very basic, pretty boring slide about trabeculae with some bullet points. There's a title, very easy. Someone will more likely be listening to you as opposed to just reading these slide bullets, and hopefully get the takeaway message and leave with that. If we apply the assertion evidence model, the bullets entirely disappear. The headline is not just a title, but it's an assertive takeaway or key point, and the photos or images that you use support your points here. So again, the structure of that trabeculae bone is actually the inspiration for the Eiffel Tower, which was a fun fact that I found while looking into this model a little bit. Again, very simple, a little bit more exciting than the previous version of the slide. And a slide that I showed you from my thesis presentation earlier, again, perfectly reasonable approach to including some bullet points as well as a visual. But if I were to apply the assertion evidence model, that bullet point section disappears. If you'll notice, the title now includes a little bit more of a takeaway. So it encompasses what I would have said or stated in the bullet points. And then that visual takes up more of the slide to bring that message across. The remainder of our advanced techniques will focus on data visualization. And one key point that I want to reiterate here is that data isn't just there to look pretty or take up space or use up some of that white space on your slides. It should be telling a story. So in a research presentation, overall, and within each slide, especially ones that you're including data, I encourage you to frame it as starting by presenting a problem or a detail that you're looking to investigate through a set of experiments. Then you're going to present the experimental or analytical approach that you used as a solution, and then those data and insights as that key takeaway. So this is an example of a figure that visualizes quite a bit of data, right? But if you were shown this in a paper, you're reading an article and you have time to address the caption or potentially look into what this legend stands for, sure, you have 10, 15 minutes with your cup of coffee to take this in and really understand what's happening. But during a presentation, this is an example of what you do not want to include. There's no data visualization flow, even if you're pointing out specific things on the slide, which I can't even find my pointer right now. It's really hard to tell exactly what you're looking at, and it makes the audience, makes it very difficult for the audience to hone in and zone in on those key takeaway points. So again, really difficult for you as a presenter to highlight key insights. This is another example. It's just a terrible figure overall. It's too crowded and too complex. There's an overlay of all of these data points. There's not really, it looks like a bunch of noise, scientifically, statistically, and also just on the paper. And it's just very overwhelming to audience members overall. So what can you do to avoid this? Take a step back and maybe consider other approaches or other forms of representation of the data that you have included in your slide. Again, strategies and approaches to choosing the right type of graph could be encompassed in an entirely separate 1-hour presentation, but we'll just keep it simple here. Cut out any noise that's not necessarily for the point that you're trying to get across. It does serve a great purpose to go beyond just copy pasting a figure that you've already spent a lot of time on that's been included in a publication. Just spend that extra 20 to 30 minutes by simplifying it for the purpose of a presentation or a PowerPoint to really make sure that you're not losing the audience in that extensive data set that you're trying to show. And then also another approach, which I'll go into some examples, just breaking down into simpler visuals. You can build things up. For example, start with just axes, incorporate additions of different overlays of data traces and points as well. And that way, keep it very conversational throughout the presentation that you're giving. So what if you can't strip down a figure to bare bones, right? What if you have a lot of data in a graph there? What can you do to ensure, ask yourself this, that your presentations are effective? You'll want to highlight things for your viewers. So if you didn't notice the hidden dolphin in the rows before, this little circle will draw your eye to that and make you realize that now. And then even more than just guiding their eye to something, you might want to point it out explicitly as well. So another advanced technique, this is called using pre-attentive visual cues. So if I asked you to take this slide and count how many threes are in this cluster of data, it might take you 10 to 15 seconds, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less based on how you visually process information. But if you incorporate visual cues, and highlight those threes in a different color, it makes this a lot easier, right? You can also, again, change the color of something in a larger data set or on a figure, change the size of something that you want to draw attention to, or the orientation. Another example from my thesis, I had these Fourier transform infrared graphs, and I wanted to highlight and draw the audience's attention to these features at this wavelength region here. So I included a little arrow that was in the publication that complemented this data. But even further, you can also use colors and color coding to further draw the audience's eye to those features and anything that you might be verbally sharing and talking about as well. Another example, so if you have to include, again, a lot of data and you want to focus on data that's a little bit difficult to see, you can put in insets, for example, that are color-coded to the regions of interest, and they zoom in on these data sets, as opposed to just assuming that people will be able to locate and zone in on these features here, where here you can see the differentiation between the intensities of these peaks a lot more effectively. So this next image might seem a little bit out of place for this presentation. You might recognize this country. It's home to a lot of cute animals, also some really crazy bugs. Personally love koalas and kangaroos. This is a map of Australia, and it looks like it's on fire. When this image was shared, just like this, it went absolutely viral. So people thought that it was depicting a snapshot satellite image of forest fires at one point in time happening across Australia. And it just caused this huge stir across the internet. And that wasn't the case at all. So this was actually an overlay of all the forest fires, which is also still very sad, happening in Australia over the period of I think it was 6 months. So this highlights the point that data labeling is very important, right? So the misinterpretation or lack of labeling in this particular case put everyone in a panic and highlighted the importance of clear and effective data labeling. I don't think any of your thesis presentations are going to cause a global frenzy, but it's still important to exercise clear and effective data labeling, whether it's in a PowerPoint, a poster, or a manuscript. And some things for you to consider. You want to make sure you're labeling your axes clearly and that those axis labels are large enough to see. You can use legends or direct labeling techniques, which I'll go through, and then you can also explore the use of color to strategically highlight key points. So in contrast to overusing color in text, using some color in your figures to highlight specific key points. So here you can, again, just an example of incorporating a legend if you have the space within your graph that coordinates the colors of the data points to those in this UV-Vis spectrum. You can also explore using a legend as well as direct labeling on the figure that you're incorporating. Here's another example of legend, not a legend, but direct labeling of these data points on the data set. So also an additional use of color that's interesting. So the Washington Post and New York Times have really nice ways of highlighting key points within their figures. Always nice place to get some inspiration for how you might want to organize things when you're showing a lot of data, especially. Another example of direct labeling here, you can use color, gray out anything else that's not relevant to the point that you're saying or sharing verbally at that time. And then here, even a layer further, they have some direct labeling of data points as well as text, and they also change the color of the text to match the line to further iterate the correlation of that data. So I do have some videos, but we're going to skip them. We're going to share this slide deck with you all so you can review these on your own time. But I'll pass it over to Andrea to finish us off, and then we'll go into some Q&A.
Okay, final stretch, right? We should have put the agenda back on the presentation to cue all of you that we are coming to an end, and we will probably go maybe a few minutes over time, but not much, maybe 2 or 3, if you have questions, and we're happy to stay and answer them. So you hopefully go back a week from now, go back to this presentation, you're working on your slides, you're trying to incorporate some of this or other advice that you got, and you have your slides finalized. Now, while we talk about this, I would like, if you're still there, to put in the chat, if you could do one thing to improve a slide deck before you're presenting, right? If you could change one thing or do one thing to improve it, what would that be? And you can put that in the chat, and while we talk about actual recommendations to have your slides ready to go for the presentation day. So of course, you have to proofread everything, make sure there are no typos. And when we say proofread, not only your text, but make sure that all your slides are cohesive, that your layout is the same. More often than not, we will combine slides from different presentations that we have given over time. That will happen more and more as you progress in your career, and they end up being a little bit of a Frankenstein. It's okay at the beginning, but we need to make sure to polish them. We need to make sure that the font we're using is the same, that the colors we're using are the same, that there's consistency across. If not, it will look like unpolished and that kind of last minute put together. So proofread and check your layout. Practice, and we're going to talk more about this in a second. Very quick and practical notes for how to practice, where to practice, with whom to practice. And then finally, you're going to present. And the day of the presentation means that you actually have to prepare for your delivery. And although this could be a whole different workshop, I just want to say that if you're giving a presentation on Zoom, do a tech check, arrive early, connect, practice on Zoom as well. If you're in person, arrive early, make sure that everything is working, relax yourself, take a deep breath. You got this, you can do this. So when it comes to practicing, I would say there are different ways you can do this. Ideally, practice with an audience. It's going to make a huge difference. Try to find people from in and out your field, people who would be willing to listen, who would be willing to provide feedback. Don't tell them, oh, I'm going to practice. Would you mind listening to my talk and tell me what you think? Because that tell me what you think could mean anything for everybody. Some people are going to focus on your actual slides, others are going to focus on your delivery. Others are going to focus on your nonverbal communication, if you move your hands too much, or if you touch your hair, or you fix your glasses. So instead of that, try to create a little rubric, and we'll give you one so you can edit accordingly. So you can ask for structured feedback. Hey, would you mind checking my presentation? I made things easy for you. I'm giving you this roadmap for you to pay attention to all of these things that I have right here. And then when you practice, and this is something I took from a course that I participated not that long ago, they made us record ourselves and then watch our videos without sound, listen to the sound without the video, and then combine the two. And you would be amazed how much information you can pick up about the things that you're doing right and the things that you're doing wrong by just separating those two. So that's another good way of practicing. I mentioned this already, why you should request for structured feedback. And I think that the other big component of this is that once you have that structured feedback, once somebody has given you a score or has written you a note about the things you need to modify, you can take all that and go back to your presentation and make those changes. So I think that's very important to have as well. We will provide you this with the resources. This is a rubric that we put together based on the presentation we gave today about all the tips and strategies to create an effective slide. And it's in a Word document, so you can actually modify this table and include whatever you feel your audience should be focusing on when you're practicing. And with that, I think we can make a pause here. We do have some frequent asked questions that actually anticipate or touch upon some of the topics you already mentioned in the chat and the questions you were making in the chat. But I want to open the floor for any live questions that you might have. Feel free to unmute yourselves or drop it in the chat.
And again, we'll share the slide deck with those FAQs as well as all of the resources we've mentioned. Andrea and I have been compiling a ton while preparing things that we've found useful. So we'll send that all over in a nice folder and packet for you to review. I'm very glad everyone thought this was helpful. Thank you all for coming. And let us know if there are any topics you'd like us to cover. Happy to answer any questions.